we're going to cover, you're going to want to learn from pictures first. So after today, after I introduce all these structures, the rest of today, tomorrow, spend time at home with the pictures, the drawings, of course, the illustrations from the lecture slides, but also there's pictures of the model on Canvas. And the idea is when you come into class on Thursday and you sit down with these models, you're not learning the structures for the first time. You're hopefully just reviewing at that point. So get a handle on them at home first. And that should translate to more efficient time in class. And then besides Thursday, then you've got your Friday open lab, and then Monday open lab that I'm going to do at 4:30 the following week. Right, organization of a nerve and associated connective tissue layer. This is very, very similar to muscle, which is really nice, but the potential problem is sometimes on the lab exam, people use the terms epimecium, paramecium, endomecium instead of epinurium, perinurium, endonurium. Very similar. So just to compare the two, what's a muscle belly? What is the outer covering of the entire muscle belly called? How about the covering of the nerve? Epinurium. When you look at a muscle belly in cross-section, you see a bundle of fascicles. When you look at a nerve in cross-section, you see a bundle of fascicles. When you look at what surrounds each fascicle, which layer of connective tissue? If it's a muscle, it's paramecium. If it's a nerve fascicle, perinurium. A fascicle cut into cross-section is really just a bundle of fibers. So if it's a muscle fascicle, muscle fibers. If it's a nerve fibers. Well, what is a nerve fiber? What's another name for nerve fiber? Axon. Fibers are axons. Nerve cells are neurons. So each nerve fiber is surrounded by endonurium. When you peel away the endonurium, you may see myelin covering the axon, maybe not. But the endonurium would be outside of the myelin. Functional classification of nerves. Sensory motor mixed. So when it comes to nerves, the word mixed is not used to describe, let's say, a nerve that has both sympathetic and somatic motor output, or visceral and somatic sensory input. It means motor and sensory within that same nerve. So I may say something like, contain a mix of somatic motor axons and visceral motor axons. And that would be true. There is a mixture, a blend, a combination of both somatic and visceral. But if you're simply labeling a nerve as mixed, that refers specifically to its motor or sensory function. Make sense? It means something very specific, is what I'm getting at. Because each spinal nerve is made up of a ventral root fusing with a dorsal root, every spinal nerve is mixed. You have all the sensory fibers from the dorsal root joining all the motor fibers from the ventral root. So every spinal nerve is mixed. It's the cranial nerves that may be motor only, or may be sensory only, or may be mixed as well. Spinal nerves attach to, or you could say arise from the spinal cord, whereas cranial nerves attach to or arise from the brain. What part of the brain specifically? 10 of the 12 cranial nerves attach to the brainstem. Of those, how many attach specifically to the medulla? Five. Pons?
Three.
Midbrain?
Two.
Ganglia refer to collections of cell bodies outside of the CNS. Associated with the dorsal root is the dorsal root ganglia. These are cell bodies of unipolar neurons that either convey somatic sensory or visceral sensory information. We also have autonomic ganglia, and we'll look at them and name them in chapter 14 on Thursday. Those contain the cell bodies of post-ganglionic autonomic motor neurons. Next is cranial nerves. We've already looked at several images, and some of these are being repeated from chapter 12, part 1. We've looked at several images that show parts of cranial nerves, like a little stump, but definitely not the whole thing. Very soon, we're going to start going through slides that show the entire nerve, so you can see it from beginning to end, because you need to know what they innervate. And then also, when it comes to the word innervate, that usually applies to motor, right? So you have motor nerve fibers innervating a target, controlling that target. If you have a sensory nerve, say like optic, you could say that it innervates the retina, but in reality, it originates at the retina. Because innervates implies a nerve meets up with the structure and communicates with it. But what actually forms the nerve that we call optic nerve? Well, it's the axons of ganglion cells, which are housed in the retina. So the more appropriate phrase would be, the optic nerve originates in the retina, as opposed to the optic nerve innervates the retina. That being said, I'm going to be general on the exam, because I don't want to give away if it's sensory or motor. So I'm not going to use originates for sensory, innervates for motor. I'm just going to put innervates each and every time. Basically asking you, what's at the other end of this nerve? And the answer to any of these questions that I ask will not be brainstem or pons, medulla, midbrain, and I get that all the time on lab exam 5. Trigeminal, what does it innervate? Pons? No.
Facial.
Pons, midbrain, medulla will not be the answer to any innervation question. What does the trigeminal have to do with the pons? It's attached to it, right? It emerges from that part of the brainstem. But when I ask what a cranial nerve innervates, I'm talking about what the other end, not at the brainstem end, the peripheral end.
So what do you say for trigeminal? Facial sensation or facial
tree muscles.
Oh, that's the second part.
Receptors of the face.
Okay.
Yep. All right, some characteristics. So there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves. 10 of the 12 attached to the brainstem, the other to the forebrain. Generally speaking, cranial nerves attached to the brain near their associated motor or sensory nuclei. Now take one like vestibulocochlear. So 6, 7, and 8 are right in a line here, right at the junction between the pons and the medulla. Yet of 6, 7, and 8, which of those three is considered to be attached to or associated with the pons?
5, 6, and 7.
5, 6, and 7.
Yeah.
Right? So abducens, we associate with pons. Facial, we associate with pons. Well, vestibulocochlear is right next to facial, but it's associated with medulla. Well, how can you tell looking at this picture? You can't. You're just seeing where the nerve emerges from or attaches to the brainstem. You would actually have to follow the nerve fibers inside of the brainstem and see where they go, see which nuclei they connect to. And it just so happens the vestibular and cochlear nuclei are in the medulla, not the pons. So we associate 8 with the medulla. We say it attaches to the medulla or is associated with the medulla. They are numbered from most rostral to most caudal. Generally speaking, this is true, but there are exceptions. So if we start rostral and work our way caudally, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 6, 7, 8, we're kind of going lateral. We're not really going caudally at this point. And then once you hit 8, it's caudal again. 9, 10, 11. But then 12 is not caudal to 11. 12, you have to come all the way back up, right, to the medial side of the olive. So 12 is an exception to that general rule. All except vagus serve only the head and or neck. What does vagus mean? Wandering, the wanderer. So of the 12 cranial nerves, it's the one that wanders into the ventral body cavity. Not only does it wander into the ventral body cavity, it gives off tons of branches that innervate most organs in the ventral body cavity, almost all of them. And it accounts for 90-something% of all parasympathetic output to our visceral organs. Most names reveal the structures they serve or their functions. Optic serves eye. Oculomotor serves eye. But oculomotor not only tells you it serves the eye, it also tells you it's a motor nerve. Hypoglossal doesn't tell you if it's sensory or motor, but it does tell you it innervates the underside of the tongue to control the tongue muscles. Facial. What does that name tell you? It's your face, right? Is it mostly sensory from the face or motor to the face for facial? Motor. Most of the sensory comes from trigeminal. Most of the motor comes out through facial. Now facial tells you face, trigeminal doesn't. What does trigeminal tell you? Has 3 parts. Right. 3 branches, 3 parts. So each name tells you something, maybe the location, maybe the function, maybe something else. Vagus doesn't tell you function, doesn't tell you location, it just tells you it wanders. Be able to describe the locations and functions of these cranial nerves, so know what they innervate, or if it's sensory, a more appropriate phrase would be know where it originates. In other words, know it's at the other end of the nerve. Because what we've looked at so far is where it attaches to the brain. We have yet to see a single image that shows where that nerve goes, what's on the other side of it. And that's what we're going to look at next. Be able to classify each as motor, sensory, or mixed. Be able to describe how one can test the function. And we'll go through at the very end, assuming we have time, we did it in another class. And we'll go through cranial nerve tests for each and every cranial nerve. Do you have the handouts? There's 2 of them. The one with a little picture of the brain at the bottom. This one you can fill out right now as we go through. It's not asking for very detailed information about function. It just doesn't give you space to get detailed information about all the functions. It gives you space for about half of them. That's what the lines are for on the bottom right. But I would use it more for the name and then knowing the function. Is it motor? Is it sensory? Is it both? And then maybe under function, you could summarize in a word. Just for this table, I'm not saying that's all you need to know when it comes to the exam. You need to know the actual function. But for something like this, keep it very brief. So not giving you much space. Alright, so we're going to focus, so we've already seen the images that have the little nerve stumps. We have the real brains, we have the cartoon images, the brains, brain stem. So let's look at the full picture. This is the entire olfactory nerve. And in some cases, in a book, in a program, they'll point to the olfactory bulb and refer to that as cranial nerve 1, which is incorrect. cranial nerve 1 isn't actually a nerve at all. It's a collection of nerve filaments. So they originate in the olfactory epithelium in the roof of the nasal cavity. And these smell receptors send their axons through the bone to the underside of the brain where you have the olfactory bulb. The olfactory bulb is made up of mitral cells. The olfactory nerve filaments synapse onto the mitral cells in the olfactory bulb. So we cannot view the bulb as cranial nerve 1, although they sometimes do that. What are the holes that the olfactory nerve filaments are passing through to reach the olfactory bulb? Learn them in chapter 7.
Cribriform foramina.
That's one name for it, but what's the name that tells you what goes through the holes?
Olfactory.
Olfactory foramina, yeah. Sensory, motor, or mixed? Cranial nerve 1. Sensory. Under function, in a word, what could you put?
Smell.
Smell. Olfaction. Cranial nerve 2. Sensory, motor, mixed.
Sensory.
Sensory. In a word, function.
Vision.
Vision. The color coding here is a reminder that half of the information from the right eye goes to the left cerebral hemisphere, and half the information from the left eye goes to the right cerebral hemisphere. Basically, what's crossing is information from the contralateral visual field. In other words, from the right eye, each eye has a left visual field and a right visual field. The right visual field from the right eye goes to the left hemisphere, crosses over. But left visual field inputs from the right eye remain ipsilateral. So those are the ones that stay on the same side. Because it's from the left visual field, so it's already where it needs to be, on the right side of the brain. Left visual field from left eye crosses to the right primary visual cortex. Right visual field from left eye remains ipsilateral. That's to the left primary visual cortex. So if we follow the path, you have the optic nerves. They run into this structure called
Optic chiasma.
or optic chiasm. Chiasm or chiasma means crossing. So this is where half of the axons cross and half do not. And then once you follow them past the optic chiasm, you're now in the brain. So it's not a nerve. So instead of optic nerve, it's now called, you can just read it.
Tract.
Optic tract. Optic tract. So then you have to go to the thalamus, because that's true for all sensory input headed to the cerebral cortex, except olfactory. So you have the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. And then these fibers run through corona radiata, but the corona radiata that contains optic fibers can be called optic radiations. Right, so optic radiations of the corona radiata. Just a specific region of corona. All right, 3, sensory motor mix. It is motor, the name tells you, oculomotor. The name also tells you what it innervates. So eye, but more specifically, extrinsic eye muscles. It doesn't actually innervate the eyeball, it innervates the extrinsic eye muscles. How many of them does it innervate? 4 out of the 6. How about the 2 it doesn't innervate? Superior oblique, lateral rectus. So the other one. Notice under motor function, some of these cranial nerves provide somatic and or parasympathetic. Are you going to find any sympathetic axons passing through these cranial nerves? None. So you have to remember those 2 nicknames of the autonomic nervous system. sympathetic division is called thoracolumbar. It reminds you that the preganglionic sympathetic neurons originate in the thoracic spinal cord segments and upper lumbar. Not in the brainstem, so no use of cranial nerves. Sympathetic output is going to pass through spinal nerves. But what was the nickname for the parasympathetic division? That's the functional nickname, rest and digest, and functional nickname for sympathetic is fight or flight. Anatomical nickname, thoracolumbar for sympathetic, reminds you where the preganglionic fibers originate. And then for parasympathetic, craniosacral. Cranio for brain, so brainstem, nuclei. And then sacral, sacral spinal cord segments. So where do you find preganglionic parasympathetic neurons? Brainstem nuclei, sacral spinal cord segments. How do the axons get out to their peripheral targets? Through sacral nerves or cranial nerves. So you're going to see multiple cranial nerves carry parasympathetic output to its targets. This is the first one. So oculomotor not only has somatic motor output to 4 of the 6 extrinsic eye muscles, also provides parasympathetic output to intrinsic eye muscles. So that would be the iris that controls the diameter of the pupil, and the ciliary body that changes the shape of the lens, right, to help you focus. Number 4, sensory motor or mixed. It is motor, associated with pons, medulla, or midbrain. Midbrain. So from midbrain, passes through superior orbital fissure, eventually reaching the superior oblique. The nerve is named after this little sleeve of connective tissue called the trochlea. That's what allows the tendon of the superior oblique to make a right-hand turn and attach to the top surface of the eye. So for function, you could just summarize it as control superior oblique. Cranial nerve 5. So for 5, I think of the 5 digits, but also, if you can do that with your digits, 3 branches, right? 5th cranial nerve, 3 branches that cover the face. Ophthalmic division, maxillary division, mandibular division. You don't need to worry about the divisions and what each one does. You just need to know overall what's the function of the trigeminal nerve. Well, sensory from the face, general senses from the face, and then motor output to chewing muscles. Number 6, sensory motor mixed. Number 6,
Motor.
it is motor. Somatic motor to the,
Lateral rectus.
so what does the name tell you?
Abducts.
The function, abduction of the eye. So abducens is for abduction of the eye by stimulating the lateral rectus to control. So how many nerves in all control the extrinsic eye muscles? 3. They are oculomotor, trochlear, abducens. Of those 3, which one provides parasympathetic output in addition to somatic motor output? Oculomotor. To the intrinsic eye muscles. Number 7. So facial innervates the face, but more specifically, sensory or motor? mean, generally speaking, is it sensory motor mixed? It's mixed. But if you're looking at the sensory component, is it providing sensory from the entire face? No, trigeminal does that. So what's the sensory limited to in the facial nerve?
Taste.
Just taste from the tongue, that is it. So then the motor function is to control all the facial muscles except, which ones? Mastication, chewing muscles. Who controls the chewing muscles?
Trigeminal.
Trigeminal. So trigeminal is your major sensory nerve for the face. Facial is the major motor nerve for the face. In addition to somatic motor, parasympathetic motor. To the lacrimal glands to produce tears, and salivary glands to produce saliva. Number 8, sensory motor or mixed? Purely sensory. Named after two individual nerves that fuse together to form this one single nerve. So at the other end of this nerve is the cochlea and the vestibular apparatus. So what does the vestibulocochlear nerve innervate? The cochlea and the vestibular apparatus. The name tells you. And so you end up with a cochlear nerve and a vestibular nerve that fuse together to form the vestibulocochlear. Now, it looks like it attaches right between the pons and medulla. But which of those two is it associated with? Medulla. And that's because the vestibular nucleus and the cochlear nucleus is in the medulla and not the pons. So it's not just where it attaches to on the surface of the brainstem. In some cases, you need to actually follow those nerve fibers inside of the brainstem and see where they go, which nuclei they attach to. Glossopharyngeal, number 9, sensory motor or mixed?
Both.
Mixed, both. Sensory, tongue, and pharynx. So now we've got two cranial nerves that innervate the tongue for taste. They are?
Facial.
Yep.
Glossopharyngeal.
Facial and glossopharyngeal, 7 and 9. Also provides sensory from the carotid arteries of the neck, where you have chemoreceptors and baroreceptors, which we'll talk all about next semester. Motor output to pharyngeal muscles, and the parotid salivary gland. So there's 3 salivary glands, sublingual, submandibular, which are innervated by facial, and then parotid, which is innervated by glossopharyngeal. So you have both somatic and parasympathetic output in this case. If glossopharyngeal innervates pharyngeal muscle, how would you test this cranial nerve? What would you ask the patient to do? Swallow. Yeah, swallowing involves contraction of the pharyngeal constrictor muscles. There's 3 of them. That makes up the bulk of the musculature of the pharynx. Vagus. Sensory, motor, or mixed? Mixed. Does both. Sensory, taste, but not from the tongue. You actually have some taste receptors covering the epiglottis. So 7 and 9 provide taste input from the tongue. 10 provides taste input from the epiglottis. That's its minor function. Much more important, vagus provides parasympathetic output to just about every organ in the ventral body cavity and provides sensory input from a variety of interoceptors. So visceral input from thoracic tissues, abdominal pelvic tissues, And then for motor output, pharyngeal and laryngeal muscles, both of which are involved in swallowing. And then of course, all that parasympathetic output I mentioned. 90+% of all parasympathetic output travels through the vagus nerve. So if you are asking the subject to swallow, what cranial nerves would you be testing? 9 and 10, because they both innervate the pharyngeal muscle. Plus vagus also innervates laryngeal muscles. 11, sensory, motor, or mixed? Just motor. Controls SCM, sternocleidomastoid, and upper traps. So under function, I would just put SCM/up traps. Easy way to remember. And again, that's just for filling out the table. You need to know the complete function. That's a good way to summarize for that one. And then hypoglossal, sensory, motor, mixed. Motor. The name tells you. Tongue. Glosso is tongue. Innervates the underside of the tongue to control the tongue muscles. So if you ask the subject to stick out their tongue and move it side to side, you are testing hypoglossal. So here's 8, 9, glossopharyngeal. So glosso, tongue, pharyngeal, pharynx. Vagus, the wanderer, goes all over the place within the ventral body cavity. It's the only cranial nerve to pass through the neck into the ventral body cavity, although it does innervate structures in the neck as well. So baroreceptors here in the carotid artery, motor output to pharyngeal and laryngeal muscles. But its main job is parasympathetic output to all these organs in the thoracic and abdominal pelvic regions. Cranial nerve 11, it's much longer than what you probably thought. Usually we see a small portion of it at the very top, but it goes way down. Because it goes way down, sometimes it's confused with cervical nerves. So the cervical nerves extend from the sides of the spinal cord, just behind where the accessory nerve comes out. So they're right next to each other. And you can see it innervating sternocleidomastoid and upper traps. And then 12, hypoglossal, passes through the hypoglossal canal to reach the underside of the tongue, providing somatic motor output. So we have some summary tables. They don't give you a full description of function, but it gives you name, primary function in terms of sensory, motor, or mixed, the foramen that it passes through to reach its target, and the innervation, what it's targeting, what's at the other end. Now again, this is just semantics. I would say innervation/origin. Because again, if it's a sensory nerve, it's really where does it originate, not what does it innervate. So optic originates from the red. Okay? But you'll see the term innervation. I'm going to use the term innervation on the exam so that I don't give away whether it's motor or sensory. That will be part of the question as well. So a nice summary of innervation. And then this table here shows you some of the reflexes that various cranial nerves are involved in. So let's just look at one of them. Auditory reflex. Stimulus is a loud noise. How does that information get into the CNS? In other words, what's the afferent portion? Cranial nerve 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, provides information regarding sound, right? Hearing into the CNS. Well, what do you do in response to hearing a loud sound off in the distance?
You turn towards.
You reflexively turn your head towards it to see what it is. What brainstem structure is involved? Houses the upper motor neurons that control this reflex.
Corpora quadrigemina.
Which part? Yes. Which part specifically?
Superior.
Superior clavicle. Yep. So it says motor nuclei of brainstem and spinal cord. Well, in the brainstem, that includes the nuclei housed within the superior clavicle. So efferents, cranial nerve 3, 4, 6. So this is all to move your eyes toward that loud sound, right? So you're going to move your head and your eyes. And then to move the head, where's the 11? Huh. So they have 7 for the muscles of the face, 10 for vagus and cervical nerve. The vagus must be for parasympathetic output. 7's facial muscles. This was sent to me years ago now from a former student who was in the nursing program when they came across this. It's from American Nurse Today, a magazine, 2006. They thought it would be handy, and I think it's actually very handy, so I'm sharing it with you. See if you can figure out what each number represents. So let's just go in order. So this is essentially a head, right? A face, part of the neck here. So number 1 would represent the nose, or olfactory. 2 and 2, the eyes, right, for vision. And then what surrounds the eyes? Extrinsic eye muscles. Those are controlled by 3, oculomotor. I really think they should have 4 here and 6 here, but they have 4 down here and 6 over there. But what do 3, 4, and 6 have in common? Those are the 3 cranial nerves that control the 6 extrinsic eye muscles. Number 5, giant number 5 across the whole face. So it's across the entire face because it's trigeminal, which provides sensory input from the entire face. What about the motor component of 5? What does it control?
Chewing.
Chewing muscles. All right, 6, abducens, got that one. 7 is a giant bracket. Again, covering the whole face.
Facial.
Regular 7 and a backward 7, covering the entire face. 7 is called?
Facial.
Facial. And is it sensory or motor that's being provided to the entire face? Motor. So it controls all facial muscles except those chewing muscles. And then as far as sensory, it's not really providing sensory input from the face at all. It's really just the tongue. 4, what purpose? Taste. 8 represents the ears, which would make sense because the vestibular apparatus and the cochlea are in the inner ear. Right? So 8 provides us with hearing, but also equilibrium. 9, they have on the tongue. What is 9? Glossopharyngeal, so glossotongue. What action, what function does it have at the tongue?
Sensory.
Is it motor or sensory?
Both.
Sensory, taste from the tongue. Where does the motor output go? Through glossopharyngeal. Pharynx. But it's on the tongue for taste, that makes sense. 10 should not be on the tongue. That one should be somewhere else. 10 does provide taste, which is probably why it's on the tongue, but not taste from the tongue. That's just 7 and 9. It's taste from the epiglottis. So I don't know what they could have done different, maybe made the tongue a little shorter and then put 10 just above for the epiglottis, something like that. 12? Why is that on the tongue? Provides motor output to the tongue, controls the tongue muscle. And then 11,
Accessory.
right where the upper traps are located, because it controls the upper traps as well as sternocleidomastoid. So it's not perfect, but it's pretty cool. It helps. Spinal nerves. 31 spinal cord segments based on the 31 pairs of spinal nerves that extend from the cord. Every segment has a pair of ventral roots, dorsal roots, and dorsal roots. So in chapter 12, part 2, spinal cord, we covered the anatomy of the white matter, the anatomy of the gray matter. We saw the dorsal root and ganglion. We saw the ventral root, and in a few of the images, we actually saw the roots fused together to form a spinal cord. And then it stopped there. We didn't see anything else. It turns out that those spinal nerves that are formed are extremely short, like a centimeter. They immediately branch. So there's 3 branches: dorsal ramus, ventral ramus, rami communicantes. So the spinal nerve technically does not emerge from the CNS and go all the way out to reach the target. Instead, it branches immediately after it's formed. And it's going to be one of those branches that actually reaches the target. Most of the named nerves, like femoral, sciatic, radial, ulnar, those are branches coming off of the ventral ramus. But we still refer to them as spinal nerves. Why? Because they originate from the spinal cord. They are nerves that originate from the spinal cord. But the actual spinal nerve is a very, very short segment right here. So now we're going to see images that show what's outside of the cord. So the spinal nerve, those 3 branches, and where they go. We'll come back to this one when we actually start naming the plexuses. There's 4 of them. And selected nerves from those plexuses. In chapter 12, part 2, we already covered the regions. You already know how we name the spinal nerve pair. So remember, there's 8 spinal nerve pair from the cervical region, but only 8 cervical vertebrae. 7 cervical vertebrae. So C1 to C7 spinal nerve pairs emerge superior to the vertebra that has the same name. Spinal nerve pair C8 is not associated with a vertebra C8 because there is no vertebra C8. So you would say it emerges inferior to C7 or superior to T1. And then spinal nerve pair T1 all the way down emerges inferior to the vertebra that has the same name. That's all stuff we went over chapter 12, part 2. So I'm going to move down to peripheral distribution of spinal nerves. There is one type of cervical segments can be denoted as C1 to C3 all the way to C8, right? Well, at the bottom under coccygeal, you see where it says segment C1. You can't have 2 C1s. This is C01. I left the O out. C01. To differentiate between cervical one and coccygeal one. You can't load BC. That was my typo. So we're going to go through two maps. This map here is going to show us where motor nerve fibers go upon leaving the spinal nerve. Right? They can go through the dorsal ramus, they can go through the ventral ramus, they can pass through rami communicondyles. But we're just focusing on motor. And then we'll look at a map that's almost identical, except now we're just focusing on sensory. So we're watching sensory nerve fibers pass through the dorsal ramus, ventral ramus, and rami communicondyles to get into the cortex. So let's start with motor output. I'll go through it on the slide first, and then we'll come back to the study. You've got your ventral horn, and lateral horn. Lateral horn has preganglionic sympathetic neurons. Ventral horn has lower motor neurons. So this is our somatic motor nucleus, this is our visceral motor nucleus. Follow the preganglionic sympathetic fiber, goes through the ventral root, through the spinal nerve, passes through rami communicondyles, and may synapse in this first sympathetic ganglion, or option 2 may continue deeper into the viscera of the ventral body cavity to synapse in a ganglion somewhere else. This sympathetic ganglion that's right next to the vertebral column has many different names, one of which is the sympathetic chain or paravertebral ganglion. So that's one option. This is rami communicondyles, but it can be divided into a white ramus and a gray ramus. What makes the white ramus white?
So myelinated?
Myelinated axons. What makes the gray ramus gray?
Unmyelinated.
Unmyelinated axons. So you have to go back to chapter 11. We have type A, type B, and type C nerve fibers. It is the preganglionic sympathetic type A, B, or C. B, lightly myelinated, medium-sized axon. And a bundle of these lightly myelinated axons forms white matter, so white ramus. So then let's say it's going to synapse right here in this first sympathetic ganglion onto the cell body of your postganglionic sympathetic neuron. What it's showing you, again, is options. You can go back through rami communicondyles to pass through the dorsal ramus to innervate a structure of the back, or the ventral ramus to innervate a structure of the limbs, ventral body cavity, or ventral body wall or lateral body wall. If you're going to innervate structures in the ventral body cavity, the gut, the lungs, you're going to pass through sympathetic nerves to get there. Right? So 3 options. This postganglionic sympathetic neuron can continue into the viscera, can go back through rami communicondyles, specifically by passing through the gray ramus, to then exit through the dorsal ramus to reach some target on the back, or the ventral ramus to target anything else besides the back or viscera. Right, so again, 3 branches. The dorsal ramus innervates the back, literally the back of your torso. That's it. So in reality, this dorsal ramus is a fraction of the thickness of the ventral ramus. They are not equal, as shown, not even close. So if you're going to the back, you have to pass through the dorsal ramus. If you want to go into the ventral body cavity, to the viscera, you're going to have to pass through rami communicondyles. If you want to go anywhere else, upper limb, lower limb, ventral body wall, lateral body wall, then you go through ventral ramus to get there. Dorsal ramus serves the back, rami communicondyles serves the viscera, ventral ramus, everything else. So it's by far the thickest branch. This model actually does a pretty realistic job with the rama. So here's anterior, posterior, so anterior, posterior, dorsal root ganglion, so ventral root. You can see those two roots come together and form this very short spinal nerve. And then that immediately branches into these two, and the two on the bottom are rami communicantes. The one on top, which is also really skinny,
Dorsal ramus.
dorsal ramus, and then the rest of it, which is really thick, ventral ramus. Okay, so those structures are on this model. So let's now go through the study guide. Efferent fibers, slide 35. We're just looking at motor distribution. We're ignoring dorsal horn, dorsal root, because that's all sensory, right? Just focusing on motor. So ventral horn, lateral horn. Axons. Ventral root contains axons of somatic lower motor neurons, also called alpha motor neurons. And these axons may continue to innervate muscles on the back by passing through the dorsal ramus, or these axons may continue through the ventral ramus to innervate muscles of the ventral or lateral body wall, or the upper or lower limbs. So we're just looking at the ventral root, and within it, just looking at the red axon, somatic motor. So it just described two possibilities. This somatic motor axon, after passing through the spinal nerve, can either go through the dorsal ramus to get to skeletal muscles of the back, or the ventral ramus to get to skeletal muscles of the front or sides of the trunk, or upper or lower limbs. So what's not accounted for? Which of the three options is this axon not going to pass through? It's not an option. Dorsal ramus is an option. Ventral ramus is an option.
The rami.
Rami communicantes is not an option. You don't see the red going through. There are no muscles inside of your ventral body cavity, except one, diaphragm, which is innervated by the phrenic nerve, which comes off the cervical plexus. That's it. So there's no somatic motor output passing through rami communicantes. There's no skeletal muscles to innervate within the ventral body cavity. What you could say, though, is that skeletal muscles make up the ventral body wall, the lateral body wall, the dorsal body wall, but they're not found inside of the ventral body cavity, except the diaphragm. So if you want to get to the ventral body wall or the lateral body wall, you pass through ventral ramus. You want to get to posterior body wall, dorsal ramus. But you're not going to go into the viscera. No skeletal muscles in there except diaphragm. Axons of autonomic, preganglionic, sympathetic motor neurons form the white ramus before synapsing at sympathetic ganglia. So now you're following the blue fiber through the ventral root, through the spinal nerve, and there's only one path that it's going to follow. From the spinal nerve through the white ramus. You will not see preganglionics going through dorsal ramus or ventral ramus. They're always going to pass through white ramus to reach a sympathetic ganglion. Once that ganglion is reached, the preganglionic ends, right, forms a synapse with the post. So now where does the post-ganglionic sympathetic fiber go? Now you have three options. You can continue inward into the viscera of the ventral body cavity by passing through sympathetic nerves, or it can go backwards. Backwards meaning back through rami communicantes, except this time passing through the gray ramus. And you would only do that if you're trying to get to the dorsal ramus to reach the dorsal body wall, or if you're trying to get to the ventral ramus to go anywhere else, limbs, anterior or lateral body. So what would be an example of a structure in the back innervated by these sympathetic neurons, postganglionic sympathetic neurons? Chapter 5. Sweat glands.
Oh, that's what I was thinking.
Sweat glands are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So if those sweat glands are in the upper limb, how are you going to get there? How are the postganglionic fibers going to get there? Passing through the ventral ring. But if you're trying to get to smooth muscle of the stomach, you're going to pass through. So you've already gone through rami with your preganglionic. Now your post, rather than going through rami backwards, is going to continue forward through some sympathetic nerve.
What about the spinal erectae that are always on, like keeping your posture? Like,
So that's somatic motor,
oh,
not
so,
autonomic.
So it wouldn't, okay.
It's just somatic motor controlled by reflexes at a subconscious level. But anytime you control muscles, it's somatic. Whether it's
I'm not
voluntary
controlling
or
it.
involuntary.
Yeah, when I'm okay. Whether
It's
it's
always
bound.
somatic.
Okay.
Yeah. Right, because there's no autonomic innervation of skeletal muscles. It's all somatic.
Okay.
Somatic doesn't mean you have to be controlling it voluntarily. It means you can.
Gotcha.
Axons of some of the postganglionic sympathetic motor neurons form the gray rings. Some, because the other option was to continue through the sympathetic nerve to visceral organs. But it may go backwards through gray ramus to get out through dorsal or ventral. Note, ventral and dorsal rami contain axons of alpha motor neurons and postganglionic sympathetic neurons, destined for similar body regions. So that's why we see the red and the black traveling together. Somatic and autonomic output headed for the same body regions. The exception would be there's no somatic motor output passing through rami communicantes. Second, ventral rami at the thoracic level travel anteriorly as the intercostal nerves. These nerve plexuses that you see here, a plexus is a big network, a web. There's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of blending together, so axons that are passing through cranial nerve pair 2 may blend together with axons passing through cranial nerve 4, not cranial nerve, cervical spinal nerve pair 4. So they all blend together and form the plexus. The only place you don't see a plexus is from T2 to T11, the thoracic spinal nerve pairs. Those ventral rami do not intermix to form plexuses. They emerge as individual nerves called intercostal nerves, and then they go anteriorly. So first laterally and then anteriorly as they come around the rib cage. They're right here. So these ventral rami coming off of C1 to C5, they form the cervical plexus. And then after that, you have the brachial plexus. Then you have intercostal nerves coming off the thoracic regions. And then when you get down to the lumbar, you have the lumbar plexus and then the sacral plexus. And then lastly, white and gray rami together form rami communicantes. So here's a picture of the roots fusing together to form the nerve, which immediately branches to form a dorsal ramus. Looks like this one's innervating erector spinae muscles, perhaps. And a ventral ramus, which at the thoracic level becomes the intercostal nerve, travels anteriorly. Or rami communicantes, which are these two here, which take you to that sympathetic ganglion. So now we're looking at the same map, but for sensory input rather than motor output. So this time we ignore the ventral root, the lateral horn, the ventral horn. We focus just on the dorsal horn, the dorsal root, all sensory. Dorsal root contains axons of somatic sensory neurons and visceral sensory neurons. Their cell bodies are located in the dorsal root ganglion. So what's the structural classification for these neurons that we're describing as somatic sensory or visceral sensory? That's the functional class. What's the structural class? Unipolar. They're unipolar neurons. Unipolar neurons have their cell bodies in ganglia. Visceral afferent fibers innervating interoceptors of the back. And really, this is again where originates is a more appropriate term than innervates, because really visceral afferent fibers originate at receptors, right? They don't actually innervate receptors. But that's a term we use loosely to describe what's at the other end. So visceral afferent fibers have interoceptors at the peripheral end, right? And then those signals come down those afferent fibers into the CNS. What if those interoceptors are in the back? What ramus will be used to bring this information into the spinal cord? If they're originating in the back. The dorsal ramus. So it says visceral afferent fibers innervating interoceptors of the back and somatic afferent fibers innervating exteroceptors of the back. They're both going to pass through the dorsal ramus, then the spinal nerve before entering the dorsal root, and then from there the dorsal horn. So visually you're just looking at the top of this map. So from interoceptors or exteroceptors, or for that matter, proprioceptors. If it's associated with the back, then those unipolar neuron axons, the peripheral process is going to pass through the dorsal ramus, then the spinal nerve, before entering the dorsal root, and then from there we'll head into the dorsal horn. And if it's somatic in nature, the red, somatic sensory nucleus. If it's visceral, then it's the blue, visceral sensory nucleus. What if the receptors, intero, extero, proprio, are in the lower limbs? How are those peripheral axons or processes going to reach the CNS? By passing through the ventral ramus, right? If it has anything to do with upper limbs, lower limbs, anterior body wall, lateral body wall, then it's going to be ventral ramus. What if it's coming from the viscera, inside of the ventral body cavity? It's going to have to pass through rami communicantes. White or gray ramus?
White.
Happens to go through the white ramus. What about the exteroceptors and proprioceptors of the viscera?
Same.
There's no such thing. It's all interoceptors of the viscera. Proprioceptors are only in muscles, tendons, joints. Exteroceptors, skin. So viscera inside the ventral body cavity is just interoceptors. That's why that's the only thing listed there. There's no somatic sensory input coming from the viscera. It's all visceral. So we covered 2, 3, 4, number 5. Note the ventral and dorsal rami contain axons of somatic sensory neurons and visceral sensory neurons that innervate receptors in similar body regions, as we would expect. another look at the rami. Here we're actually starting with rootlets. Dorsal rootlets form dorsal root, ventral rootlets form ventral root. The two roots come together to form the spinal nerve. Spinal nerve branches into a dorsal ramus, a ventral ramus, which should be much larger than what they're showing, and then rami communicantes.
Oh.
Rami communicantes you into the sympathetic ganglia. There's a chain of them, and you can see a very small portion of the chain right here, called sympathetic trunk ganglia, or sympathetic chain, or paravertebral ganglia. Lots of names for this one. And we'll come back to that in chapter 14. Nerve plexuses. So we're looking at the spinal nerve distribution at the cervical, lumbar, and sacral regions. Why not thoracic? There's no plexuses coming off of the thoracic spinal cord segments, just the intercostal nerves. First thing you need to know about each plexus, where it originates, which spinal nerve pair, or more precisely, which ventral rami coming off these spinal nerve pairs get together to form each plexus. Right? Because this plexus is this network. So you have axons passing through spinal nerve pair C1. They go through this first ventral ramus, but then also mix with fibers from C2 ventral ramus, and C3 ventral ramus, and C4 ventral ramus, and C5 ventral ramus. They get spread out all over. So it's all this intermixing going on.
Why is that?
Don't know. Just how it evolved. That's just the organization. Seems like lack of organization, but, well, I guess the reason would be to bring all of these inputs and outputs together. Right? So in terms of outputs, maybe there's a particular muscle, and some of the lower motor neurons come off of spinal nerve pair C1, and some C2, and some C3. So we're going to bring all those together into one nerve that's going to go to that one muscle. Something like that. So what's the origin of cervical plexus? C1 to
C5.
C5. Brachial plexus. C5 to T1, so there's overlap. Some of the fibers in C5 are going to contribute to the cervical plexus. Some will contribute to the brachial. From brachial, which is C5 to T1, we're going to skip all the way down to T12. And then from T12 to L4 forms the lumbar plexus. And then the origin of the sacral plexus would be what?
L4 to S.
L4 to S4. So again, overlap. L4 contributes to the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus. The green dots that you see correspond to the nerves I've selected within each plexus. So notice for the cervical plexus, aside from the cranial nerves they have labeled here, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different named nerves. Of those, you need to know one. The friend.
Thank you.
Welcome. Brachial plexus. There's about 10 or so. Lots of nerves here. You need to know these 4. Musculocutaneous, radial, median, ulnar. And those are the 4 easiest. On an upper limb model, if you want to locate the radial nerve, where are you going to look?
Radius.
Radius. You want to find the ulnar nerve. Ulnar.
Oh.
Right, so here's ulnar nerve, and then over here is radial, and then what would be right between them along the midline? Median, which means midline. Now they have the same names up here in the arm, and you can still say, so think anatomical position, so lateral is thumb side, radius, medial is pinky side, ulna. So if you're looking at 3 nerves passing together through the arm, which one would be most medial?
Ulnar.
Ulnar, most lateral?
Radial.
Of these 3, not all nerves, but at least 3. Radial, and then right between them, median. Yeah, so it still follows that same pattern in the arm as it does the fourth. Then the fourth one, musculocutaneous. Cutaneous is skin. This one's going to be very superficial. So this is actually the most lateral. Innervates muscles of the upper arm like biceps brachii, but also the skin. So I think on one of these images they gave it a different color. This one here. Oh no, radial got a different color. So radial got green. And then musculocutaneous, so it goes along the humerus, branches to innervate flexors like biceps brachii, but then from there runs laterally to the skin. Branches go off to the skin. So radial on the outside, ulnar on the inside, and then median right between.
So should we be more familiar with the whole arm view or like just the up close view?
Well, I could take this image and point, here or here or here.
Okay, so.
Model as well,
Okay.
anywhere on the model. And some pictures are more magnified. Like here, we're just focusing up on the axillary region. And it's still the same sequence, right? So start with the 3. Radial is lateral, ulnar is medial, and then right between the 2 is median. And then the most lateral off to the side here is musculocutaneous. Coming off the lumbar plexus, you've got quite a few nerves. Again, half dozen or so. You need to know one. Femoral. And then sacral plexus. You need to know 3, but it's almost like 1, because the 1 splits into the other 2. What's the biggest spinal nerve there is? Sciatic. Well, sciatic is really joined together, which is why I like this picture a little bit better than this one. See, this one, it just looks like a single nerve, but here you can actually see that there's 2 nerves fused together, and in some individuals, they're not fused. The sciatic, it consists of 2 separate nerves running side by side, the tibial and the common fibula, and that's what the sciatic becomes. Now, for most people, you have a single sciatic nerve emerging from that sacral plexus. It's going to continue down the posterior thigh. Just before you hit the back of the knee, it's going to split. The branch that continues straight down is tibial. The branch that moves off laterally to the lateral leg bone, fibula. It's called common fibula because it's going to have some branches as well. Anything with the name common in it, and you'll see this with blood vessels next semester, means it's going to branch into others. Like you have a common carotid artery here, and then it branches into the external carotid and the internal carotid. So that's it for the moment. Take a break, and we'll resume in about 10 minutes.
Oh, I got your audio off, so yeah, you can talk about Ann all you want
So
now.
if I have a question,
You know that movie where you like hear the mic
Well, if
and
you're-
it's like,
yeah.
If you're like me, not for,
yeah, and then.
Make it go.
Make it gun.
but if you're like me, I'm not gonna hear it for 30 seconds anyway. So.
Great.
There you go. Okay, let's figure out what's going on here, Lily.
No. How do you?
Yeah, just you want to take it out.
Yeah.
So what's been going on this whole time? Has it been recording?
Yeah.
Sorry, Ann.